My name is Hannah, and I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, and I'm a second-generation Bosnian American. My parents came here separately in the early 90s, and then after meeting in a Bosnian restaurant on Union Road, they started dating and eventually got married. I was born in October of 1996, and apparently my parents were both very happy during that first year of my life, but the very hazy memories I have of my father from that time are the only ones I have of him. That's if they're not just false memories, planted there after hearing 100,000 anecdotes about him being such a wonderful person and a perfect father during my first year of life. But then I suppose you're wondering how a man who walked out on my mother and I is remembered so affectionately. So affectionately, in fact, that some people still call him a hero. Well, if you're sitting comfortably, I'll begin. My father grew up in a small Bosnian village called Obadi, which at the time was part of the now defunct nation of Yugoslavia. From what my mom's told me, it must have been a pretty beautiful place to grow up. It's nestled up in the mountains, surrounded by forests for hunting and streams for fishing, and for almost 2 generations following World War II, there was a long and uninterrupted peace in the region. But then, and I'm ready to skip over a lot of the history here, war came. And when it came, it was very bad. And because it was based along ethnic lines, the Yugoslav Civil War was this real depressing neighbor versus neighbor kind of war. It was so bloody that the war sparked a number of smaller, more localized incidents of conflict, which included the Bosnian Civil War. And it's during this war that my dad escaped Bosnia. Mom and her side of the family left a little earlier, so while they had to suffer through some of the war's earlier stages, they thankfully escaped before the war in Bosnia kicked off. My dad, on the other hand, stayed in Obadi to protect his family, even when other Bosnian families were fleeing to Europe, the UK, or America. And this was because, at first, he didn't think that they had anything to worry about. Without getting into too much detail, and please don't crucify me in the comments for oversimplifying this, the factions in the Bosnian Civil War were as follows. The Serbs were the minority, while the Bosnians and the Croats formed the majority. And at first, the Bosnians and the Croats were on the same side, so it looked like they were going to win. But then the Bosnian Serbs started getting backing from their much stronger motherland, Serbia, which really turned the tides of the battle and prolonged the war. And so my dad and his family went from feeling safe up in the mountains to having Serb forces getting closer and closer each day. The men of the village formed a kind of militia and held the line as long as they could before they were forced back into the village. But by that time, they'd managed to evacuate all their vulnerable family members, so by the time the Serbs surrounded Obadi, the fight was to keep them from burning it to the ground. And Mom said, the way Dad told the story, there had always been so much hope around Obadi. Hope they'd be able to hold off the Serbs until NATO committed to driving them back. But as the Serbs surrounded the village and their snipers began picking off the Bosnian militia one by one, my dad and his friends realized that they were doomed. And even worse, their families were in danger too. You see, believing they'd be able to hold off the Serbs long enough, the men of Obadi had told their women and children to wait in a neighboring village, and unless they warned them of the imminent attack, they too would be surrounded, captured, and quite possibly massacred. The militia had no choice but to try their best to break through the encirclement, but given how outnumbered and outgunned they were, that was considered to be the option that wouldn't end well. But then, one very early morning, in absolute desperation, my dad went out into the woods and tried to find a way through the Serb lines, and incredibly, he found one. The Serbs had neglected to properly guard an open field, which lay just on the other side of some trees and on the eastern side of Obadi, and presumably they believed that my dad and his buddies weren't dumb enough to try to run through an open field, especially not if they had snipers in the surrounding hills. But their assumption had left the Bosnian militia with a golden opportunity for escape, at which point they could just circle around the Serbian lines and then rescue their families for a second time. My dad's fellow militiamen asked if he was certain the way was clear, and when he told them yes, they moved out as quietly as they could and made it to the clearing just as the sun was rising ahead of them. They started running through the clearing, through the gap in the Serbian lines, and they're running and running without any shots coming their way. and they're yelling at my dad that you're a goddamn genius. You saved us. And then just as they're all nicely grouped in the center of that clearing, the Serbs opened fire, and my dad said that they didn't have a chance. All they could do was run or lay low, but all the same men were shot, cut down by machine guns, or picked off by the Serb snipers. All my dad said that he could do was run and just pray a Serb bullet didn't find its way to him. And by some miracle, my dad made it to the tree line, escaped the Serbs, and then managed to circle around the back of them when they swept in to finish off the wounded Bosnians and burn Obadi to the ground. While the Serbs were burning and looting, Dad managed to get to the village where all the families were staying and warned them that if they didn't flee, they'd be next. And having seen that his comrades were slaughtered, my dad decided that he was getting out of Bosnia, and after that, he didn't rest until he, his mom, and his aunt were on a plane to the United States, where they'd eventually settle in St. Louis. Obviously, my grandma, God rest her soul, wouldn't shut up about how heroic my dad was, how he'd personally led a near unwinnable charge against the Serbs in order to come to the aid of his family and other civilians. She also talked about how he was the only survivor of his militia unit, and that God must have blessed him something special for him to walk away from a bloodbath like the kind he experienced. Mom said that Dad never liked her talking like that, so she'd never do it around him, but Mom always figured that's because he had a kind of stereotypical survivor's guilt. You know, the way the heroes never consider themselves heroes, that old shtick. But around 18 months into their marriage, just before I turned 1 year old, they had a massive, catastrophic fight, in which my father revealed the truth of what happened that day. Mom told me that Dad would sink into deep depressions that would sometimes last for a week at a time. He'd drink heavily, stay away from the house for days on end, and by the time I was 1, my mom was sick to death of it. She told me no more drinking, no more staying out with the other Bosnian guys until all hours of the morning, and that if he wanted her to stay, he was going to have to seek psychiatric help for his post-war traumas. And then Dad says something like, "I don't deserve any help," to which she responds, "Of course you do. You're a hero." And he then hits her with a line he'd repeated over and over, which was, "I got people killed." At which point Mom kept telling him what she always did, that it wasn't his fault, that he couldn't keep blaming himself, and that above all, he did the right thing. And that's when he flips and tells her she's wrong. He didn't accidentally get anyone killed. He did it on purpose. Dad knew that if they tried to break out of the Serb encirclement together, he and his buddies would be cut to pieces. And if not a single one of them walked away to warn the next village, their families would die too. And so Dad took a risk, a major risk, but he sold his soul in the process. That morning, when he was supposedly probing Serbian lines to find an opening, he wasn't doing that. Instead, he was looking for the Serbs themselves, and he did so with a white flag of surrender made out of an old shirt and a broken stick. The Serbs took him prisoner, and then took him to their commander, who asked if he was an envoy sent to announce the village's surrender. And Dad said no, that the villager militia would die before surrendering their homes to the Serbs. But unlike them, he didn't want to die. He wanted to live, even if that meant living someplace else. The Serbs laughed, amazed that this Bosnian had the balls to ask them to simply let him leave. But that's not what Dad was proposing. Oh no. He proposed handing over the entire militia so that the Serbs could slaughter them all in one fell swoop. The only price that he asked was that they let him walk away once the shooting had stopped. And so, that's what he did. Dad ushered his comrades out into the open, but didn't run at the head of them like he'd claimed to have done. Instead, he simply waited at the tree line, watching as the Serbs slaughtered his brothers in arms in a prearranged and horrific ambush. Then once they were all dead and he heard the Serb commander yelling at his men to stop shooting, he just walked out into the open, stepped over the bodies of his lifelong friends as he made his way to safety. He was convinced the Serbs would shoot him. In fact, he told my mom at one point that he wished they did. and the Serbs knew killing him would be the easy way out, and that the ultimate knife through the heart of my father was going on with his life, knowing that he was a traitor to his country and his people. It's obviously when he reunited with his family in the next village over, my dad talked as little about his escape as possible, and allowing everyone to assume that what he'd done was heroic instead of selfish and contemptible. He managed to keep it a secret for a while, but like I said, it was only a matter of time before he snapped and spilled his guts to my mom one night, and she told him to leave. She knew what he'd done was terrible, and when it comes to ensuring the survival of yourself or your family, people sometimes end up doing some frankly unthinkable stuff to each other. But in the moment, she didn't know what else to do, so she told him to just get out. She said that she thought he'd come back, that he'd go get drunk at the bar that he always went to, and then come back in the early hours of the morning, stumbling drunk and begging her forgiveness. But he never came back. Ever. He got into his car, drove out of town, and never returned. And Mom thinks that he's still alive somewhere because they're technically still married and she's his next of kin. So, if he does die, we'll probably end up finding out about it pretty quick. And people say that I should think about reaching out to him, but honestly, that's not something I'm really interested in just now. People say I'll regret it if I don't, and that you always think you have time when really you don't. But I'm not scared to face my father with the knowledge of what he did. I'm scared what he might have become. I know there's a chance that he moved on, made a life for himself, and that meeting him for the first time as an adult might prove the catharsis that sometimes I think I'm sorely in need of. But I think the reality isn't so rose-tinted, and that now he might just be more of a monster than the creature who betrayed his comrades. I know that if he didn't do what he did, I might not be here to write this, but all the reasoning and rationalizing in the world won't change what he did. Many years ago, in land far from these shores, a man makes a speech in front of a crowd of villagers, and they hang on to his every word. No one dares speak, and no one dares look away. And when the man finishes speaking, he takes out a lighter and sparks a flame, and behind him, a woman stands tied to a wooden post with a gasoline-soaked motorcycle tire around her neck. So much of the acrid flammable liquid had dripped and soaked into the earth around her that the man only needs to toss the lighter at her feet to ignite the fumes and set her ablaze. As the woman screams, no one in the crowd says a word. Most have known the woman their whole lives. She is an elder in the village, a woman of influence. But as the flames roast her alive and her shrieks saturate the air around them, no one in the crowd raises a single word of protest. And the woman's crime was the theft of a tiny ball of opium from a rustic processing center hidden away in the jungles of western Myanmar. She told the man who burned her alive that her son was suffering from a broken arm, and since she couldn't afford medicine on her meager salary, she'd stolen the opium in the hopes of relieving his pain. He was said to have listened intently, as if he deeply sympathized with the woman's dilemma, and then once he secured a full confession, he sentenced her to death. Judge, jury, and executioner. And that man, who set a person on fire as easily as you or me would light a candle, was the head enforcer for a group of heroin smugglers based in what's known as the Golden Triangle out in Southeast Asia. The woman wasn't the first he'd killed, nor was her execution the most cruel or gruesome he'd performed. He'd dispatched hundreds over the years. Hundreds of thieves, hundreds of rule breakers, hundreds of escaping workers who tried to leave before their contracts were up, all shot, hanged, beheaded, or torched. And that's how they enforced discipline out there, how they kept poor workers in line when there was so much money flowing in from all the Americans coming over to buy their heroin. That man, that cold-blooded killer, was one of the most highly respected and highly feared men in the global heroin trade, and that man was my grandfather. He did that job for just over 10 years, from his late 20s to just after his 40th birthday when he realized that he needed to get out. Now, I don't know all the details and why he had to leave, but I just know his life was in danger, and so were those of my mom and aunts. I guess if you kill so many people, you make probably a few enemies. And so my grandpa gathered up as much money as possible, had himself and his family smuggled into Vietnam, and then they bought a bunch of fake South Vietnamese diplomatic passports, and then basically just walked onto an Air Force passenger plane like they were VIP refugees. All the big South Vietnamese politicians were leaving the country, and they were stealing anything that wasn't tied down to ensure the communists didn't get their hands on it. So, when Grandpa shows up to the airport in a crisp business suit and a couple of suitcases stuffed with $100 bills, no one batted an eyelid when he and his family showed up and politely demanded a place on an outbound transport plane. Once he and his family arrived in America, they settled in the Bay Area, and my grandpa used his money to invest in small businesses, usually of Southeast Asian origin. He had steaks and banh mi stores, Thai restaurants, Filipino grocery stores, you name it, and Grandpa was making money from it, which is how he managed to get even richer on this side of the Pacific Ocean. He lived the life of a legitimate businessman for another 40 years, and then after successfully fighting off cancer not once, but twice, it came back a third time and the prognosis was terminal. He went to his deathbed, having never ever spoken of what he did back in Myanmar. My grandma had some idea of what he did back then, enough to know Grandpa might have killed some people, but she had no clue just how vast and varied Grandpa's crimes really were. It took until he was on his deathbed and a sudden conversion to Catholicism, prompting a full and unfettered confession, that we learned just how monstrous he used to be. My mom said that over the course of around 2 to 3 days, he was visited by the same priest over and over, and in that time, he made dozens of intricate confessions, stopping only when he needed to rest. Mom said it was all terrible stuff so terrible that she could barely believe it. She thought at one point that my grandpa might have been delirious or maybe hallucinating or something, and she and Grandma tried to put a stop to it, like he doesn't know what he's saying. But he did, and he knew exactly what he was saying. He might have been slipping off his mortal coil, as they say, but his mind was still very much intact, and once he'd made that clear to the priest, the confessions continued. Now, like I said, there were many, but according to my mom, this one was the one that always stuck with her. To just about any big money business, security is one of the most important aspects of day-to-day operations, and with my grandpa and his employers, they ran their territory like it was their own sovereign state. They basically had their own border police, what amounted to their own army and air force, and even their own ID cards that they gave to workers so they knew who was who. They were able to operate with such freedom through bribing government officials, but it didn't ensure complete autonomy, not to mention that everything had to operate under a shroud of total secrecy. So when a large American NGO suddenly showed up in the Myanmar section of the Golden Triangle and started going from village to village and vaccinating children, it wasn't a good thing for my grandpa and his bosses. It was a huge, huge problem. All the right government officials had been bought, but if the Americans got wind that the heroin producers had turned a huge chunk of the western province into a giant heroin factory, then there'd be trouble. The news would no doubt make its way back to the American ambassador, who would have no choice but to inform the president, and after that, who knows what kind of foreign intervention that might bring. This was at the height of the Vietnam War too, and although the American public didn't know about U.S. Special Forces roaming around the countries they shouldn't have been in, the people in those countries sure as hell did. And so when I say my grandpa's organization considered the Americans a very real threat and not an abstract one, you can understand their apprehension when a U.S.-run NGO just showed up out of nowhere. Right after they showed up, my grandpa's organization sent out a missive to the villagers, and they were to warmly welcome anyone who visited their villages and were to present a convincing veneer of cooperation. But any family that allowed their child to be vaccinated would suffer serious repercussions. And you might wonder why the organization didn't want kids getting vaccinated, and the explanation is a multi-layered one. Firstly, a kid didn't need functional legs to be able to process poppies for heroin production, so the organization didn't care if the children contracted polio and lost the use of their legs. It just meant more workers for the production line. Secondly, there was kind of a conspiracy theory among the organization's leaders. Some of them thought that the vaccine weren't really vaccines, that the NGOs were a CIA front, planting tiny little listening devices into all the children. They told the villagers that too, that the vaccinations would be incredibly painful and would ultimately destroy their lives by implicating them as drug traffickers to the CIA. But then, thirdly, and finally, having anyone arrive in the region who might possibly show the villagers that there's a better way of living, that couldn't be allowed to happen. The organization had to assert its complete control over the region. Anything outside of that undermined their authority and could not be permitted. And at first it seemed like the villagers were receptive to the organization's requests. After all, they were never anything but receptive and cooperative. Their very lives depended on it. But then, once the NGO actually started sending people to the villages, along with government representatives who spoke their language, a lot of the villagers realized that they were being duped. The NGOs were smart. They didn't just show up with white coats and big needles, looking incredibly creepy. They gave out basic medications at first: aspirin, hydration powders, baby formula, snacks for the kids, anything that would have an instant impact and win the villagers' trust. As you can imagine, to people who'd never really experienced modern medicine before, their efforts were a resounding success, and dozens of families from each village approached the NGO as subtly as they could and secretly got their kids some shots. Well, word got back to the organization, and they put my grandpa onto the task of administering those punishments. They got the names of every family whose child had been vaccinated against polio, then went around all the villages taking away the kids who had gotten shots. The organization told the families it was just a precaution, that they wanted their own doctors to monitor the children to ensure the vaccines were genuine. If they were, and the children came to no harm, they'd be swiftly returned home with some monetary compensation. Children were made to work, so no child meant a drop in the household income. But if they did come to harm, then the organization would not only be in a better position to treat them, but they'd be in a better position to bring legal action against the NGO, having made all the relevant observations and analyses. But, as you can probably guess, that was not what the organization intended to do, and I don't know how they did it exactly. Grandpa never said, and I know that they returned those kids to the village, just not to their homes. They stacked their bodies in big piles, just outside the village that they came from, and then just left them there for the villagers to find. And it was my grandfather who killed each and every one of them en masse by poisoning their food and water. My mom said that she and Grandma just sat there, listening in horror as Grandpa told the story, and by the end of it, the priest was just as pale and aghast as they were. All of his deathbed confessions had been horrific, but like I said, it was that one in particular which stuck in my mom's mind and haunted Grandma until she too was resting in her grave. The only reason my mom ended up telling me was that I wanted to visit Myanmar to see the places she and Grandpa had come from. She kept obfuscating whenever I brought that subject up because I wanted to know where exactly I had to travel in order to see my ancestral homeland. And I pushed, and she kept pushing back until one day, she finally caved. She told me all about how Grandpa wasn't the hard-working, charitable, and successful businessman us kids thought he was, and how before they moved to the United States, Grandpa had been a completely different person. I can't go visit my mother country because there are still people in Myanmar who'd kill me if they knew who my grandfather was. And not just people in Shan province who'd take revenge for their murdered kids. I'm talking government officials who could quite easily make a person disappear, and I mean really disappear. During its inception, the United States proudly cast off its shackles of subjugation and severed its bonds to the British Crown. But over the next 200 years, by means of wealth, media, and influence, America has ended up electing its very own aristocracy. Be it the Bushes, the Kardashians, the Vanderbilts, or the Roosevelts, certain families have firmly asserted themselves as the upper echelons of American society, but perhaps none more so than the Kennedys. The Kennedy family are one of the most prominent and influential political dynasties in American history. Having originated in Ireland, the family's American story began with Patrick Kennedy, an immigrant from County Wexford who settled in Boston in 1849. His son, P.J. Kennedy, became a successful businessman and politician, setting the stage for the family's meteoric rise. However, it was his grandson, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., who propelled the family to wealth and influence. Joe Kennedy Sr. was a savvy businessman who amassed a fortune through banking, real estate, the stock market, and the liquor business, most notably during the decade of alcohol prohibition that gave rise to gangsters and bootleggers alike. But despite dipping his toes into the criminal underworld, Joe Sr. later married Rose Fitzgerald, daughter of Boston Mayor John Fitzgerald, which solidified the family's political ambitions. Joe Sr. served as the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom during the late 1930s, but soon turned his ambitions towards his children and began preparing them for leadership and public service. Perhaps the most famous of Joe Kennedy's children was his second son, John. More commonly known by his initials, JFK, John went on to serve as the 35th President of the United States and is known for his leadership during the Cuban Missile Crisis, his role in advancing civil rights, and his assassination in 1963, which shocked the world. John's younger brother, Robert, would serve as U.S. Attorney General and later represented the state of New York as a United States Senator. He too was a prominent advocate for civil rights and anti-poverty programs, but his assassination in 1968, during his campaign for the presidency, was a devastating blow to the family. The youngest Kennedy brother, Ted, also served as a U.S. Senator, while his older sister, Jean, served as the 17th U.S. ambassador to the nation of Ireland. Yet there is another Kennedy sister, and for the longest time, her story remained a closely guarded family secret. And this is the tale of Rosemary Kennedy. Rosemarie Kennedy, or Rosemary as she came to be known, was born at her parents' Brookline, Massachusetts home on September 13th of 1918. Named for her mother, Rose Fitzgerald, her birth was a difficult one, exacerbated by the shortage of doctors due to the outbreak of the Spanish flu. In order to prevent the birth from commencing in earnest before the arrival of a doctor, the Kennedys' nurse ordered Rosemary's mother to keep her legs closed. Yet this did nothing but to ensure that young Rosemary's head stayed in the birth canal for 2 hours longer than it should have, starving her of oxygen in the process. As Rosemary began to grow, her parents noticed that she was missing major developmental milestones, and by the age of 2, she had a great deal of difficulty in just sitting up and crawling, let alone learning to walk, actions that other children her age were accomplishing with ease. Yet instead of being open and honest regarding Rosemary's intellectual disability, her parents hid them from their friends in the wider public and allowed only a small group of close family members to know the truth. The Kennedys entrusted the family tutor with getting Rosemary up to speed with her intellectual peers, but when it became increasingly obvious that the girl required sustained and specialist help, she was sent to a Pennsylvania boarding school that focused on educating those with intellectual disabilities. At age 16, Rosemary relocated to the Sacred Heart Convent in Elmhurst, Providence, Rhode Island, where she was educated separately from the other students in order to keep her condition a secret. Her reading, writing, spelling, and counting skills were reported to be at a 4th grade level. 2 nuns and a specialist teacher, supposedly named Miss Newton, worked with Rosemary on a specialist curriculum in a separate classroom far from the eyes of her fellow students. Administrators changed their policies to allow Rosemary's older brother and future President John to accompany her to a school dance. There, he acted as a kind of buffer between Rosemary and the other girls, in the words of one classmate, made her seem no different at all. In exchange for the school's cooperation, the Kennedys paid for the construction of a brand new tennis court. During the late 1930s, once Rosemary had blossomed into a young woman in her late teens, she led a very active social life, read books, and occasionally accompanied her family on state visits to far-flung nations. She was by no means an invalid, and although her intellect was dwarfed by that of her younger siblings, she could at worst be described as childish by those unaware of her condition. In an interview with Woman's Day magazine, a young Rosemary told journalists that she was studying to become a kindergarten teacher, had an interest in social work, and even harbored longings to grace the silver screen. She presented herself as a shy, articulate, but carefully spoken young woman, but in reality, Rosemary presented nothing more than a carefully rehearsed facade. When reporters from the Boston Globe requested an interview with Rosemary, her father's assistant tailored the responses, which she then committed to memory in what amounted to hours of intensive study. The statement read, "I have always had serious tastes and understand life is not given to us just for enjoyment. For some time past, I have been studying the well-known psychological method of Dr. Maria Montessori, and I got my degree in teaching last year." Around the same time, Rosemary flew over to the United Kingdom and met King George VI at Buckingham Palace during an official state ceremony. Rosemary practiced the complicated royal curtsy for hours, but at the event itself, she tripped and almost fell in front of hundreds of onlookers. With characteristic British grace, the crowd completely ignored Rosemary's near miss, except of course for the royal aide who offered his assistance. Then, when she presented herself to His Royal Highness, King George merely smiled and bid her the warmest of welcomes to his court. Rosemary's mother never discussed the incident and treated the debut as a triumph, which for all intent and purpose is exactly what it was. A young woman with learning difficulties had conquered both her disability and her anxiety, and had met the King of England in the process. Yet unfortunately, this period in her life marked something of a high point, as following her return to the United States in early 1940, a 22-year-old Rosemary would become, and I quote, increasingly irritable and difficult. As she approached her mid-20s, Rosemary began randomly flying into violent rages. She would destroy property, attack friends and family, with the episodes occasionally ending in convulsions or even full-blown seizures. After being expelled from a summer camp in western Massachusetts, Rosemary was sent to a convent school in Washington, D.C. Gripped by a kind of late-blooming teenage rebellion, Rosemary began sneaking out of the convent at night, with many of the convent's nuns suspecting her of carnal activity. And they warned her of STDs and the risk of pregnancy, and while it's not clear if Rosemary really was searching for romance, it's clear that she yearned for her freedom. Yet such reckless behavior frightened her frustrated parents, and when it continued unabated, the family became concerned that it might affect their political prestige. And during the fall of 1941, when Rosemary was just 23, her parents approached some of the most acclaimed psychologists in America, seeking solutions to their daughter's problems. They consulted with some of the most highly qualified medical professionals in the entire world, men who had dedicated their lives to the pursuit of medical excellence. Back then, their solution constituted the cutting edge of psychotherapeutic treatment, yet less than 100 years later, their barbarism is considered nothing short of a crime against humanity. Young Rosemary Kennedy was to be given a lobotomy. Developed in the 1930s and 40s, a lobotomy is a surgical procedure that involves severing connections in the brain's frontal lobe and thalamus. They were used to treat mental illness that didn't respond to other treatments and gained popularity due to alternatives such as straitjackets, padded cells, and physical violence being considered inhuman. The procedure involved drilling holes into the skull, then inserting a sharp instrument into the gray matter. This way, a surgeon could essentially scramble the parts of a person's brain that accounts for their personality. While the procedure certainly made some patients much calmer, it obviously caused significant personality changes which, more often than not, manifested as apathy, as well as a chilling kind of desocialization, whereby the patient acted beyond the confines of regular human behavior. As you can imagine, lobotomies could also have some serious and sometimes deadly side effects, so much so that when replacement drugs such as Thorazine were introduced, the number of procedures dropped off dramatically. Yet incredibly, lobotomies still remain legal within the United States. This is the procedure that Rosemary was subjected to, and even at the time, those outside the medical profession considered it a dystopian solution to a tragic and deeply upsetting problem. Joe Kennedy Sr. knew his wife would never consent to it, yet instead of discussing it with her, Joe had the procedure performed in secret and only informed Rosemary's mother when it was completed. Rosemary's lobotomy took place sometime in November of 1941. Dr. James W. Watts of George Washington University School of Medicine carried out the procedure with the assistance of Dr. Walter Freeman. It was described in the notes of an observer as follows. After Rosemary was mildly sedated, we went through the top of the head, Dr. Watts recalled. I think she was awake. She had a mild tranquilizer. I made a surgical incision into the brain through the skull near the front. We just made a small incision, no more than an inch, and after that, we placed an instrument inside. The instrument Dr. Watts used looked like a butter knife. He swung it up and down to cut brain tissue. As Dr. Watts cut, Dr. Freeman asked Rosemary to recite the Lord's Prayer, sing God Bless America, or count backwards. We tried to estimate how far to further cut based on how Rosemary responded. Only when Rosemary became incoherent did the doctors cease scrambling her brains. Dr. Watts later stated that, in his opinion, Rosemary wasn't dealing with learning difficulties, but rather a deep form of depression that stifled her development and education. All the patients the two doctors lobotomized were diagnosed as having some form of mental disorder. Yet following the analysis of a written review, authored by the two doctors, multiple medical professionals backed their opinion that Rosemary was suffering from some undiagnosed depression and not advanced learning difficulties. Bertram S. Brown, a former aide to the Kennedys, who also went on to serve as the director of the National Institute of Mental Health under JFK, stated that the push to declare Rosemary mentally disabled instead of mentally ill was intended to protect JFK's reputation during his future runs for presidency. He also added that the lack of support for mental illness is part of a lifelong family denial of what was really so. Yet in lobotomizing Rosemary, her parents had changed her condition from one they could hide into something no one could ignore any longer. Following the procedure, it swiftly became apparent that the lobotomy had severely damaged Rosemary's mental capacity. Her intellect and social skills had been reduced to that of a 2-year-old. She could not walk or talk, and she was severely incontinent. Rosemary was subsequently institutionalized, living first at Craig House, a private psychiatric hospital around an hour-and-a-half's drive north of New York City. She was then relocated to Jefferson, Wisconsin, where she lived for the rest of her life on the grounds of the St. Coletta School for Exceptional Children. The Archbishop of Boston, Richard Cushing, had discussed St. Coletta with Rosemary's father and explained it was an exceptional facility with the capacity to house just over 300 vulnerable young adults. In order to properly inspect the school, Joe Sr. traveled there in person, but was still unhappy with her daughter's prospective living arrangements. Then, instead of allowing Rosemary to live among the school's student body, Joe had a private house built for her about a mile outside St. Coletta's main campus. Situated near Alverno House, which specialized in dealing with adults who needed lifelong care, the nuns began calling the house Kennedy Cottage, after the home's only permanent resident. At Kennedy Cottage, Rosemary was tended to by 2 nuns, Sister Margaret Ann and Sister Leona, who provided her with round-the-clock care. The cottage was also frequented by a ceramics teacher who attempted to teach Rosemary pottery around 3 times a week. Rosemary also had access to a car and driver, ensuring that she could travel at will, and a dog to ensure that she was never truly alone. Rosemary's parents might have ensured that she was perfectly well looked after and had no material wants or needs, But that lifelong care came at a price, and that price was almost complete severance from the family's affairs. It took 20 years for Rosemary's mother to visit her at the Kennedy cottage, while her father failed to visit her even once. Author Kate Clifford Larson had stated that Rosemary's parents hid the truth of her condition from the wider family for just over 20 years, and that none of her siblings were ever informed of her true whereabouts. During JFK's 1958 Senate re-election campaign, the Kennedy family explained away Rosemary's absence by claiming she was reclusive and a deeply private person. It was only in 1961, once John had secured the presidency, that the family finally revealed the truth behind Rosemary's condition, but even then, it was only a partial truth. The Kennedys explained that Rosemary was mentally disabled, but only mildly so, and completely neglected to mention that she had been brutally lobotomized at the hands of some of the finest doctors available. Ironically, Rosemary's father, Joe Sr., had a catastrophic stroke not long after the partial truth of his daughter's condition was made public. He too was rendered unable to speak and unable to walk, but unlike Rosemary, his location was shared with the wider family, and he was not denied visitation in his hour of need. Following Joe Sr.'s death in 1969, and without his patriarchal influence over the family, the Kennedys began reintroducing Rosemary into their collective affairs. She was taken to visit relatives in Florida and D.C., and was even taken back to one of her childhood homes on Cape Cod. Having love and familial attention in her life proved the best medicine imaginable, and it was during this time that Rosemary went from being unable to move independently to being able to walk again, albeit with a pronounced limp. She never regained the ability to talk, and one of her arms remained permanently palsied. But the quality of life Rosemary enjoyed in her final years was a huge improvement on what she'd experienced before. It wasn't until 1987 that knowledge of Rosemary's lobotomy became fully public. In her book, The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, historian Doris Kearns Goodwin divulged details of several candid conversations she'd conducted with the family, one of which was a full and frank account of Rosemary's lobotomy. The general public was horrified by what they read, and the fact that it had been kept secret for more than 45 years was something even the most cynical of political insiders found hard to stomach. By the late 80s, lobotomies had been fully exposed as a cruel and unnecessary treatment that verged on medical malpractice and pseudoscience, so the discovery that a member of American royalty had been subjected to one, especially via such a callous and calculated means, was deeply shocking to the American public. Ultimately, on January 7th of 2005, Rosemary Kennedy passed away from natural causes at Wisconsin's Fort Atkinson Memorial Hospital. She was 86 years old. Sisters Jean, Eunice, and Patricia were at her bedside as she passed, along with her younger brother Ted. She was laid to rest beside her parents at Holyhood Cemetery in Brookline, Massachusetts, excluded in life, but united in death. Some credit her status and condition with being the inspiration for Eunice Kennedy Shriver to later found the Special Olympics, meaning that although her life was characterized by loneliness and familial exile, Rosemary's legacy is one of inclusion and opportunity for the most vulnerable members of our great society. Allow me to tell you the story of the Winstead Carter family of Providence, Rhode Island, or more specifically, of their only son, Ephraim. Ephraim Carter was born on October 30th of 1879 to George Austin Carter and Catherine Winstead. George Carter was almost 60 years old when Ephraim was conceived, while Catherine was just 29. The story of their matrimony is long and complex and somewhat tedious, but to summarize, their marriage was one of expedience. The Winsteads needed the Carters' land and money to ensure their dynasty placed in the upper echelons of American society, whereas the Carters needed children to continue their family line. Catherine had already provided George with 3 daughters, but as you can probably guess, that left the Carters disappointed. They needed a son, and for a long time it appeared as if Catherine would fail to provide one. George was getting older, and to put it bluntly, his baby-making abilities were not what they used to be. And so you can imagine everyone's surprise when, in January of 1879, Catherine announced that she was pregnant. The news was celebrated by those who had heard it, but there was still the matter of the baby's gender, because, as cruel and callous as it sounds, another daughter would mean Catherine had labored in vain. Back then, there were no ultrasounds or gender reveal parties, so everyone had to wait the long 9 months to see if the baby was a boy or a girl. And to everyone's infinite relief, it was a boy. A boy they named Ephraim. Unlike his older sisters, who bore an uncanny resemblance to the women of the Carter family, little Ephraim took after his mother. The Winsteads all had jet black hair and dark brown eyes, giving rise to the rumor that one of their ancestors had been a mulatto slave girl from the Caribbean. The Carters were all blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and if it wasn't for the serendipitous circumstances of little Ephraim's birth, then perhaps more questions would have been asked of his young mother. As it stood, Ephraim's arrival was treated as nothing but a blessing, but as the boy began to age, many began to consider him more of a burden than a boon. Ephraim was an energetic and eager child, and was tottering around on 2 legs by the time he was 2. This obviously meant his physical development was progressing just fine, but in terms of his mental development, the boy's relatives and Minders were astounded. By age 2.5, Ephraim was solving fairly complex puzzles, understood concepts his peers failed to grasp entirely, and possessed an impressive vocabulary to boot. Ephraim's older sisters were all in their mid-teens and early 20s, so he had no one of his age to play with for quite some time, and naturally, his mother wanted to see him properly socialized, so she arranged playdates with other children of a similar age. But this is where Ephraim started to exhibit concerning behavioral problems. In one instance, a boy Ephraim was playing with fell down, hit his face on a wooden floor, and began bleeding profusely from his mouth and nose. Instead of helping the boy, or showing any form of compassion whatsoever, Ephraim Carter simply laughed and then carried on playing with a small tin train set given to him by his father. The boy staggered around, blood pouring down his little white dress shirt, too stunned to scream or call out until one of Ephraim's minders noticed the commotion and came running to his aid. The incident was the topic of great discussion in the Carter household, both among the staff and the boy's parents. George, who was almost 63 by this point, claimed it was just boys being boys, and with the proper guidance, Ephraim would emotionally mature in line with his peers. But much to the family's dismay, Ephraim's disturbing behavior grew worse. The Carters' estate boasted one of the largest and most storied stately homes in all of New England, but it had one hell of a mouse problem. The Carters kept at least half a dozen cats of varying breeds and dispositions. All were mousers and all ate very well in the course of their work, but it still wasn't enough to stem the tide of vermin. One of the staff proposed they left poisoned cheese out at night to kill the mice off swiftly and silently. But as the groundskeeper pointed out, dozens of dead mice rotting away in the walls would smell awfully ripe come summertime. And that's how the Carters came to the decision to lay mouse traps all over the house and grounds. Ephraim was just 6 years old during the mousetrap debacle, but he had grown into a remarkably intelligent young man who routinely astounded strangers and familiars alike with how sharp and intuitive he was. But then, combined with his reckless, spontaneous, and sometimes malicious behavior, Ephraim had become a force to be reckoned with. When they were first laid, Catherine Winstead Carter was concerned that the visibility of the vermin's cadavers might disturb young Ephraim, as well as the home's many guests. She entrusted the groundskeeper with the task of ensuring the traps were emptied, cleaned, and promptly replaced each morning, before little Ephraim had a chance to see them. If he failed to do so, there would be trouble. As you can imagine, the groundskeeper did as he was asked, not wanting to incur the wrath of the family matriarch. But to his surprise, the mice seemed far too clever to take the bait. For the first few mornings, the groundskeeper would wake up, get dressed, and then walk downstairs to check the traps, only to find them all empty. The bait seemed intact, but as time went by, some of it began to go missing. The groundskeeper went to fetch more from the pantry, but upon returning to the mousetraps, he discovered that almost all of them had been triggered. He asked around the stately home staff if they'd been emptying the mousetraps sooner than he could get to them, but each and every one of them said no. The groundskeeper racked his brains, wondering tirelessly what the issue could be, until of course he asked Mrs. Carter if he could inspect young Ephraim's bedroom. And there, in a closet, they found a dozen dead mice and a scalpel. Ephraim had been dissecting them. Everyone was horrified as the news that Ephraim's antics had reached a diabolically new low, but there was hope. Ephraim's uncle Joseph had announced that he was returning from the Philippines just in time for Ephraim's 7th birthday. He too had been a troublesome child, but had found discipline in his early teens and had excelled in academia. Uncle Joseph had only met Ephraim once when he was just an infant and had been posted around the Pacific for the last 6 years, so aside from his close family members, very few of the Carter's home staff had ever laid eyes on him. So when Uncle Joseph did finally show up, the staff got to see how he and little Ephraim looked identical to one another, and the resemblance was more than passing. It was uncanny, and Ephraim took to his Uncle Joe like no one he'd ever met before, and the pair spent many a long hour together walking around the estate, and at lunches and dinners they seemed to have the queerest method of silent communication. Joe would simply look at Ephraim and the boy would begin giggling, and in the reverse, Ephraim would sometimes stare at his Uncle Joe, prompting a response which others would have only grasped at. One by one, everyone began to figure it out. Everyone except the boy's father, George. Little Ephraim Carter was not George's son at all. He was the spawn of Catherine Winstead and her own brother, Joseph. And once they saw it, they could never unsee it. The way George and Catherine acted around each other, the way Uncle Joe seemed to be able to anticipate the boy's every need, the way Ephraim always seemed to find his manners whenever Uncle Joseph was in the room. Everyone saw it, but George Carter, who went to his grave in ignorance of the grand betrayal which had unfolded under his very nose. Ephraim would go on to be shot dead during a game of cards, aged just 17. He was caught cheating and pulled a pistol on the man who accused him. Another of the gamblers were also armed, and upon Ephraim's brandishing his weapon, he produced his own and fired a single, fatal shot. It was later discovered that Ephraim's pistol hadn't even been loaded, and that either he'd simply forgotten to load, or that the whole thing was an elaborate method of ending his own life. Another version of the story is that, in a heated moment, Ephraim told one of his fellow players that it was he who had violated the man's wife. She had indeed been intact less than a year prior, and the culprit was never apprehended, and as the story goes, Ephraim knew details that no innocent man should. Many of the things Ephraim did during his brief stay on this earth will forever remain a secret, as his family did all they could to protect their reputation. But thanks to the testimonies of elderly staff members, as well as those who knew them, we now understand that the circumstances of Ephraim's birth were far from ordinary, and that the results were nothing short of terrifying. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and remember, my pants were always brown.